Hey guys, and welcome back to your inside look around college football and the NCAA. We saw a pretty incredible week of football in Week 9 with the Oklahoma Sooners losing to the Kansas State Wildcats and your very own Texas Longhorns losing to the TCU Horned Frogs. A very upsetting loss against Gary Patterson. I know we saw a big week in football. We're gearing up for not as big of a week. You know, we have that LSU-Alabama game coming up next week. Both teams are on bye. Seems like a lot of teams are taking an additional bye week or their first bye week of the season right about now. So things slowing down this week, but, still a lot to talk about here, Tam.
We have one big game that we'll talk about later in the show being Florida versus Georgia and then SMU and Memphis. And we'll preview those games later. But what I want to talk about to start out the show is, people are saying that, Oklahoma's done. That was a bad loss. One, Kansas State's a very good football team. That's point blank, period. And Oklahoma still controls their own destiny. That was not, in my opinion, as bad as a loss as Georgia has took this season. And even though Wisconsin is now out of it, Wisconsin losing to Illinois. So I feel like Oklahoma still has a lot to play for, even though I don't like them. They just have to take care of business against, the rest of their schedule, and hopefully they'll find themselves in the Big 12 championship game.
So Oklahoma, they were a top 10 team, lost to an unranked. What makes this loss different to Kansas State purely because Kansas State is actually a good team that's been in and out of the top 25 all season? Or
yeah. Okay. No, that too, and people just don't talk. People don't realize that Kansas State is a good team. Like, I understand they just lost Bill Snyder, who is one of the most well-respected coaches in the history of all of college football. But, they got themselves a guy from South Dakota State or North Dakota State, one of the two, and he's got that program going, and they have solidified themselves to be a top 25 team again after that win. They have wins against Oklahoma and Mississippi State this year. So they're a very slept-on team. And I think they can win at least 8 or 9 football games. And that's big after losing a coach like Bill Snyder, for sure.
And you make a good point about the Bill Snyder thing because that is and we talk about it all the time on the podcast, is that, losing your head coach in a really deeply ingrained program and culture can be a really big hit on a lot of teams. But when you look at Kansas State play, it doesn't look like they've missed even a step in that transition. Like, they look like the same exact Kansas State team that we see season after season. And next week, in Week 11, they have Texas after Texas comes off of their second bye. So, who knows what could happen in that game. And, the Wildcats got to be feeling pretty good about themselves, and hats off to them.
They've already played Oklahoma. They've already played Baylor. I'm not sure if Kansas State and Iowa State have linked up yet. But, they played a lot of tough football teams, and it wouldn't surprise me at all to see them 8 or 9 wins this season. But since you mentioned Texas, I do want to talk about Texas. I want to see what kind of coach Tom Herman is. They were supposed to have a massive year this year. There was all kinds of playoff hopes for Texas, and it hasn't gone your way. They've dealt with a lot of injuries, a lot of heartbreaking losses. They lost to 7 to LSU. They lost by 7 to OU, and they lost by 10 to TCU. They got to get healthy, and I hope they take this bye week and try to get as much players back as they possibly can. But, what is Herman going to do, and what is the team going to do? Is he going to be able to get his team rallied and overcome adversity and try to contend and compete for a Big 12 championship, or are they just going to settle for a 7-5, 8-4 season?
And you're right. This is a tell-all sign for Tom Herman. I agree with that. Tom Herman, still very new as the Texas head coach. It's not like he's been there for 10, 20 years. I believe this is his 3rd or 4th year.
3rd year.
And, it's hard when the expectations are as high as they are, especially for a blue blood school like Texas. It's hard to come back from those kind of losses. We talked about that last week with Wisconsin, and look what happened to Wisconsin this past week. They got smacked by Ohio State. So you don't want something like that to happen to your program, especially when you are still competing for a Big 12 title. And, who knows? You could spoil Oklahoma's season in that game because with as many losses as Texas has, I just don't see them going to the playoff. I know you and I both picked them.
They're done.
They're definitely done. We both picked them in our preseason playoff picks, but, at this point, you just got to play spoiler. You just got to play spoiler.
Well, if you're Texas case, or if you're Texas, your best case is you just went out and OU beats Baylor, and then you go out and beat Baylor, and then you get an opportunity to at least get a rematch with your arch rival. I mean, Herman does have some big wins under his name. He has beat Oklahoma. He has beat Georgia. He beat USC last year as well. So he's beat some pretty tough games, but he's also lost, some pretty tough games too. A lot of them, we have 3 really tough losses this year, and we had some tough losses last year, and it's been all over the place. And the key for me is that Herman just has to find consistency, and hopefully as the season goes on, they'll have a little bit better luck with injuries.
Yeah, and the injuries thing, it takes a big toll, right? Because when basically your entire first and second string secondary is out, that's hard. But with the recruiting classes that Texas is able to pull in, what you're really losing there is experience. It's not really talent. It's really experience and gameplay. And so, can Tom get these kids who have to go in completely not ready physically to go into these kind of games and be successful? And I mean, that's where you really do tell if someone's a good coach or not. They almost lost to Kansas not long ago either, only won by 2. And, we knew that game against TCU was going to be a tough one, and we knew that game against Kansas could have had the potential to be a tough one too.
And we told y'all that Kansas was going to contend with Texas Tech, and they ended up beating the Red Raiders. So, Kansas, I understand it's still Kansas, but, Kansas, they might win another ball game or two, but by the time the season's over.
I really didn't think we would have a moment to talk about the Big 12 getting deeper this season. Well, but just like that, with Kansas getting better.
The Big 12 is their own worst enemy because it's so hard to escape that conference with 1 loss or less, especially when you have really tough non-conference schedules like some of these teams in the Big 12 do. I know that Oklahoma, even though this year their non-conference schedule wasn't as good, just a couple years ago they had home and home against Ohio State and all kinds of big-time schools. Obviously, Texas had a home and home with LSU, and so it's hard. And then when you get to conference play, you have teams like Baylor, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, West Virginia that will give you a run for your money. And that's why I just get so frustrated about all the hype in the Big Ten, because I guess with the exception of Purdue, nobody has really been able to contend against Ohio State. And if you really even count Purdue, Purdue's just a weird team that has that school's number for some reason. But that's why I'm not a fan of the Big Ten. I want to see somebody contend against Ohio State, and I want to see, Ohio State get challenged up until before the playoffs.
And that's drastically different from the Big 12, right? Because the same argument could be made that the Big 10 is their own worst enemy, which is true. They always do manage to play themselves out, but at the same time,
it's stupid.
Because it's Ohio State. Ohio State is so domineering in that division. It's so domineering in that conference that no one can beat them, whereas you have a team like Oklahoma, who's thought to be the favorite, can lose to Kansas State or can lose to someone like Texas or West Virginia.
But the Big Ten plays themselves out in a way more stupid way than, a Big 12 school would, because to my most recent knowledge, Ohio State got gypped last year because they had a bad loss to Purdue. Yep. Okay, well, if OU's going to get a loss, or if Texas is going to get a loss, it's going to be to a really good 8 or 9 win Kansas State, Baylor. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And I hate to go back to Michigan, but even this past week, people hype up the Michigan-Notre Dame game. And what does it turn out to be? A bloodbath. I mean, not even a bloodbath. It's just hard to watch for fans because it's so slow-moving.
Yeah. And Michigan's getting all this hype again because they beat Notre Dame by a lot. And
even though Notre Dame's not that good of a team.
Notre Dame, to me, is not that good of a team. We'll see if they can handle Virginia Tech in an exciting fashion. But, I mean, besides Georgia and Michigan, those are the 2 teams on their schedule that you look okay. Like, those are respectable games at least, and they lost both of them.
Yeah, both of them.
And Georgia ended up – they might be a little bit overrated. And I don't know how Michigan – we will see –
this weekend.
We will see Michigan how truly good they are when they play Ohio State. They've lost, pretty sure they've lost close to 10 games in a row to Ohio State. And they need to end that, and they need to get over this hump, because
I thought you were about to talk about the Georgia game with how good Georgia really was, but I mean, you make a great point there too. We're not going to know how good Michigan is until that Ohio State game.
So, they couldn't take care of business against Penn State. They could not take care of business against Wisconsin. They did take care of business against Notre Dame. They still got two rivalry games left, being against Ohio State and Michigan State. And, we're going to see, can Jim Harbaugh really have his way with, his rivals, which if you look at his record against Michigan State and Ohio State, the answer is no, he's not had success. But now we're going to preview a little bit of games. We're going to represent our hometown, Dallas, here for a few minutes. Good for SMU for getting the ABC game.
Yeah.
Herbie's going to be calling that game. You got a top 25 Memphis team and a top 15 SMU team. And, the winner of this game should be feeling pretty good likelihood of clinching a New Year's Six Bowl for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's really exciting for both programs because it's kind of the rise of the American Conference. They have some teams that can go in there and make some noise. You look at Cincinnati, U of H, all of these other different teams, along with SMU and Memphis, that could really potentially make some noise in some New Year's Six Bowls. So good for them. Hats off to them. I'm rooting for Shane Buechele on the Ponies, but we'll see what happens. Memphis can't be a team that's overlooked, and they just got to put their head down and get through it.
It has shootout written all over it.
All a barn burner. Absolute barn burner.
I'm going to stick, though, with the Texas boys for sure. I'm picking the SMU Mustangs for sure. I think that Shane Buechele, he's having a great year. I'm sure it took some getting used to transferring from a school like Texas to SMU, but he's excelled and they're undefeated.
Undefeated.
The odds of them making the playoffs, of them going undefeated, are slim to none. But
that's UCF about that.
It's a big deal if you're a team like SMU and you have an opportunity to go play in a New Year's Six Bowl.
Absolutely.
That's a big deal.
I mean, it's that same noise that was made about UCF for all those years. Undefeated season, true national champions, stuff like that, potential playoff bids. Well, the American Conference is kind of making an argument here.
And, unfortunately, Houston, they've had actually a pretty tough schedule. They played Washington State and Oklahoma, so they've had a few losses already. But normally Houston's pretty good. And then SMU is having a good year this year. Memphis is normally always good.
Well,
Cincinnati's good.
Houston's got a new coach this year, too.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how this conference carries on, because this is a conference that maybe one day could have anywhere from 3 to 4 teams ranked consistently throughout an entire season. So, and really, the only other big game that we could think of that was happening this weekend is going to be the game between Georgia and Florida. The loser is likely eliminated from the playoff talk, and it is a rivalry game, and I'm eager to see which Georgia team shows up.
Yeah, I mean, that's the name of the game, which Georgia team shows up. And I think you're right. I think loser is probably eliminated, and it would be just like the SEC East to play themselves out of really contending for that top spot in the SEC. And I mean, I think we all deep down know it's either going to go to LSU or Alabama, but it's whatever everyone likes to have, float their boat, whichever. But I got to go with Florida on this one. I think, they're just playing at a really high level right now, and I don't think this Georgia team is all that good. I think overhyped is the word that I would use, as we talked about earlier in the episode.
I think that people can expect to see a Florida versus either Alabama or LSU in the SEC championship game this year. But, I mean, I think Georgia isn't as good as people want to think they are. That's no disrespect to their program or Kirby Smart.
Mm-hmm.
Just when you see them playing these big-time games, rather it be against Texas or Alabama or Florida or whatever the case may be, more times than not, they let you down. And Georgia's a very similar team like Texas. They have to find a way to get over that hump to reach that next level. And I'm not saying that Florida's over that hump either, but I do think Florida's going to win this game.
Yeah, just having a better season. Not necessarily over the hump, but just having a better season.
So, but anyways, guys, I really hope you guys enjoyed the show. Next week, we have a lot to talk about. A lot of massive games coming up next week, including the number 1 versus number 2 team in the country. So hope you guys tune in for next week's show. Thank you guys for giving us a listen. You guys have a great rest of your week.
We'll see y'all next week.